What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. Okay, so we are picking back up again with DC Rebirth, and in this video, we're actually focusing on the Justice League. Now, the Justice League in DC Rebirth, as it's written by Brian Hitch, has really received mixed reviews. I did a couple of surveys actually on Twitter, but there are people who just don't really care for Brian Hitch's Justice League. Instead, they're really turning their attention to Francis Manapul's Trinity, which, by the way, if you're not reading Trinity, you are doing yourself a severe disservice. I would highly suggest you check it out. The story's only halfway finished, like the first story is only halfway finished, which is why I haven't covered it yet, because it didn't have like a Rebirth one-shot. Francis Manapul just picked up into the Trinity, and so I'm waiting for that story to finish before I do a video on it, which is kind of the disappointing thing because it's so well written and it's beautifully drawn. Clay Mann's cover, his art for Trinity, by the way, is insanely gorgeous. But, you know, for me, I actually like Justice League. I'm really looking forward to Brian Hitch's Justice League of America, which I think comes out in February of next year, of 2017. But I'm actually kind of enjoying what he's doing right now because, you know, if you're going into the Justice League expecting a series of self-contained stories, you're going to kind of get that. But what Brian Hitch seems to be doing is leading towards a much bigger picture. And that's what this story arc really seems to pick up from. In the last story arc, they went against the Kindred. The Justice League fought against the Kindred, which were these beings that were introduced that were basically designed for the purpose of initiating the collapse of the universe. They would come together, they would effectively send out a signal, kind of like, you know, sending out this song, and it would result in like a notification, essentially, for the universe to begin the process of collapsing. Now, in that video, I made the case that what seems to be happening is Jeff Johns and the brass over at DC seem to be initiating what I would call, or I guess what Faust would call, a DC Rebirth crisis, because that really seems to be what's happening. There's been a lot of teases to the phrase crisis, a lot of teases to the idea of a crisis, even the very nature of the universe collapsing in on itself seems to be the very essence of a crisis. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, in the next year or so, we essentially get like Watchmen versus Justice League, and it ends with the universe collapsing in on itself and being recreated as this kind of perfect combination between the pre-New 52 and the New 52 universe. But the fact remains here that, you know, when it comes to this, one of the cool things about Brian Hitch is that when it comes to Justice League, he paces it out really well. He doesn't bombard you with like a whole ton of stuff and leave it to you to kind of decipher things and make sense of things. Instead, he takes it at a pretty good pace in terms of, you know, helping us understand everything that's going on. Now, again, because the League is still recovering from Kindred, because of the fact that, you know, Superman and Batman have fought one another in that last story arc, like I had mentioned, it was really just, you know, everybody kind of coming to grips with what had happened. Not only that, a lot of people were possessed by the Kindred. And so while not, you know, a lot of people died, one person did die. And that's the entire crux of this story, is how the death of one person can basically bring down the Justice League. Now, the Justice League effectively being taken down really comes by way of Cyborg. And what happens is that while he's watching the footage of really the only victim of the Kindred having her funeral, the result is that he begins to see lines of code within the computer screen. And what this does is effectively force him to start interacting with the Justice League Watchtower and crash it down into the ground. Now, this is really like the biggest weakness of Victor Stone. This is really like his biggest issue, is because his ability to merge with any form of technology is really like his one thing. It's like the one thing he can do. It's like his one namesake. The problem with this is that it's just as much of a benefit as it is a hindrance. With him being able to hack into everything, if someone were to find a way to seize control of him, they could literally take down the entire electrical grid of the Earth, not to mention the Justice League. Now, because of the fact that he's basically the Watchtower's babysitter, he's essentially just in here. That's really all he's doing, is just spending his time in here. But once he begins to see these lines of code, it results in the fact that the Watchtower just starts crashing down into the planet Earth. At the same time, because the Justice League really convenes within the Watchtower and uses that as a database of sorts, they all have their own ways of tapping into it. Now, the Superman is actually not going to be a part of the story because he's dealing with his own thing in Son of Superman and Action Comics, but, or I guess the Superman stories and Action Comics. But for Bruce Wayne, being able to tap into the Justice League Watchtower is a major part of what he does, simply because of the fact that if you were to fight a foe in Gotham City, you know, say for example, some new person just popped up in Gotham City, he wouldn't have detailed records on that person, but he would be able to tap into the Justice League Watchtower and be able to analyze and scan these global records from a multitude of intelligence agencies. And so what that would do is allow him to use the records and the abilities of the Justice League Watchtower, combine it with his own formidable computer systems and then, come to whatever conclusion he needs to. The problem with this is that by virtue of being tapped into the Justice League Watchtower, it basically creates a backdoor for this virus to essentially travel into the Batcave. And what happens is all these autonomous vehicles the Batman has begin to activate. Now, this actually creates a pretty interesting situation. And the reason for this is because Bruce Wayne, above all others, with all the experiences he's ever had, the fact that he is so intelligent when it comes to technology and just intelligence in general would lead us to believe he would have to recognize that there would be a danger on some level and having fully autonomous vehicles, which is to say vehicles that can operate without actual people. They can operate just, strictly on computer systems. Now, the other half of this was a little bit of arrogance on behalf of Bruce Wayne to look around and to say, these systems are impenetrable. No one can get into these systems. It's impossible. So I don't have to worry about that. The fact that somehow these systems were hacked by way of Cyborg means that now, suddenly everything's running amok. Bruce Wayne's kind of screwed because all his stuff's literally turning against him, which is kind of a worst case scenario. But from here, things move at a pretty reasonable clip in the sense that we really have like Bruce Wayne and Alfred trying to get out of there. Alfred's panicking, trying to reconnect everything, trying to rehook everything up. And then of course we have Victor Stone, who manages to escape the Justice League Watchtower, at which point his programming reverts back to its normal state. Now, at this point, we actually pick up with the family of Diane Palmer, the woman who had died during the Kindred event. And what happens is we initially just sort of pick up with this young girl alongside her brother, and we basically learn that like their father is just kind of off doing his own thing in the basement. Whatever it is that he's doing, we don't really know. We just only know that he's doing his own thing. Now, that's something that I want you to keep in the back of your head, because on the surface, it seems like Brian Hitch is pointing at something, but what he's going to do is pull the rug out from under us, which is actually really cool because it makes for some interesting levels of suspense as well as some funny twists and turns. But again, the biggest issue here for Victor Stone is that the Justice League Watchtower crashing back to Earth will land in San Francisco. And this is where Brian Hitch draws on a combination of the New 52 and the pre-New 52. In the New 52 continuity, one of the big aspects of the Justice League was that superheroes were relatively new. And so humanity just didn't trust them. Humanity was just like, they're not trustworthy. We can't look at them as heroes. They're people who have powers. Metahumans are inherently dangerous. We need to find a way to control them. And if we can't, keep them monitored very closely to make sure they don't become dangerous. Now, the cool thing was that over the course of the New 52, that sentiment began to change to a degree. But, for all intents and purposes, what Brian Hitch is doing is drawing on the hopeful nature of DC Rebirth, because instead of being grounded and rooted in dark, gritty stuff, DC Rebirth is supposed to be hopeful. It's supposed to be a series of stories that basically communicate this idea that there's a brighter future over the hill. All we have to do is make our way over there. And so because of that, it's really the situation where Bruce Wayne sits down and says, okay, here's where things seem to be going. Of course, having, Alfred analyze everything, all their computer systems and whatnot, Bruce Wayne comes to the realization that this is not just some arbitrary system. This is not something that went awry. It's not like Victor Stone's computer systems went nuts. Instead, someone is actively hacking through Cyborg and into the Justice League Watchtower and then into the Batcave. And so someone is specifically targeting them. Now, from here, we actually switch over to the Green Lanterns. This is where things get kind of cool in terms of how the Lantern Rings work. The Green Lantern Rings in and of themselves have changed a lot over the course of DC's history. When you had Alan Scott, it was just like a mystical ring. It was really just kind of tied to mysticism. With Hal Jordan, over the course of his publication history, the rings were established as being devices of technological origin. They were basically constructed using technology. And so, yeah, they can tap into the emotional spectrum, but they use technology to do that. Effectively, they're just little machines or little computers in these tiny little rings. And so because of the fact that they're basically computers, again, once Victor Stone gets back to Earth, he's met with Wonder Woman, he's met with Aquaman, with the Flash, Barry Allen, and with Simon Baz. His programming goes awry yet again, and it taps into Simon Baz. Now, the reason why this happened, or at least the reason why this seemed to happen, was that this connection is intermittent. It's bouncing in and out. And so again, it may be that whoever it is doing this is monitoring Cyborg. And so when he left the Justice League Watchtower, they said, okay, he's not there anymore. It's time for me to basically go back and, wait for him to arrive on Earth or whatever it is that he does. And then I can use him as a vector to continue hacking into other, devices and so on. Now, because of the fact that it hacks into Simon Baz, it takes control of his ring in its entirety and begins manifesting different things. Now, this is cool. This is actually a really interesting situation. This is almost like the Green Lantern counterpart to Emma Frost from the X-Men. I know that doesn't seem to make any sense, but what happened was in the X-Men, there have been instances where Emma Frost has used her telepathy to take over the mind of other people, most specifically Bobby Drake, and say, what you're using your powers for right now are not their full potential. Here's the full potential of what you can do. Now, all of this is contextual based on a person's understanding of the situation. And so Emma Frost being able to analyze the mind of Bobby Drake and realize the full potential of his powers is different from a computer system taking over the ring of Simon Baz. Yes, it can use his ring for a singular purpose, but computer systems don't have imagination. They can't imagine wild things. Really, the only thing this computer system could do do is bring back things the ring has already done, maybe go through the ring's, memory interface and recreate objects that have already been created or objects that are routinely used. Because I don't know if DC's ever gone through the ins and outs of how rings function on a very core level. That is to say, do they maintain memories of like former constructs that were made? Those of you guys who are really familiar about the Green Lantern mythos, you might have the answer to that question. And if you do, please post it down in the comments because I want to know the answer to that question. I'm really curious, and I haven't read enough of Jeff Johns' run to know if he's covered that. I feel like he would have, but I don't know enough to know if that's the case or not. But as Bruce Wayne's going through and analyzing these signals, there's a lot of things unfolding right here. The first is that with the Justice League Watchtower almost crashing into San Francisco, there's a lot of panic and a lot of fallout because remember, people are losing it. I mean, people are freaking out. They just came out of a global crisis which saw thousands of people essentially possessed, one of whom died, but now is the instance of the Justice League are being attacked again. And so this is really where humanity looks at the Justice League as some group that can help them, some group to keep them protected. But if the Justice League are being subdued in this form and fashion, then what hope does everybody else have? And so the logical conclusion here was that it would send markets into free fall. If the Justice League are taken out, the world's going to fall into pandemonium because of the fact that everything's going to go awry. Keep in mind, the people who are here right now in this New 52, they're looking back at things like Forever Evil, when the crime syndicate of America, showed up in the New 52 universe and villains took over everything. And so it really harkens back to that. So every time there's like this major crisis where the Justice League seem to be taken out, it's the worst case scenario. Oh my God, the world's going to be taken over by villains or something along those lines. And so people start pulling their money out of Wall Street. They start pulling their money out of banks. Markets start collapsing. I mean, it's absolute pandemonium. The other half of this, though, is that again, this gives us perspective in terms of Simon Baz and the Green Lanterns and how they compare to the rest of the Justice League. Now, I'm going to tread on some dangerous waters here. I know that there are a lot of people out there who love Aquaman. I know there's people out there who love The Flash, people who love Wonder Woman, Batman, so on and so forth. But what Brian Hitch is essentially showing us here is that none of them have anything on the Green Lanterns. The Green Lanterns are just way too powerful for the Justice League to really go against one-on-one. They really have to work together. That's one of the reasons why it's the Green Lantern versus the Justice League, because it's really the circumstance where they seem to be unable to actually hold them off. All they can really do is just play defense. There's no offensive attack on their end. If Wonder Woman begins destroying all these different constructs that are being made, new constructs are going to manifest. And so it's just kind of like this battle of attrition. The Justice League will wear out and they will be exhausted before the enemies stop, before the energy of the ring is effectively worn out, just because of the fact that it can create so many things. Now, the other half of this, though, is that the ring is not an infinite source of power. I do know enough about the Green Lanterns to know that the rings do need a battery charge. And that's kind of the important thing, is because with Jessica Cruz not being here, because of the fact that Hal Jordan sat down and said, Simon Baz, Jessica Cruz, you're both going to share a power battery. And so you both have to work together if you want your rings to maintain a charge for any real measure of time. This tells us that there is a timetable here. It's not like Simon Baz would just continually fight the Justice League forever. There would come a point where his ring would just lose energy. It would just run out of power. And so again, jumping back to Bruce Wayne as really, the brains of the operation when it comes to the Justice League, he begins again to go through this line of code. And what he learns is that this code was created by a guy named James Palmer, who went by the alias of Jesse James. Now, in his earlier days, in his formidable days, James Palmer, or Jesse James, whatever you want to call him, was basically like this Robin Hood hacker. He was this guy who was like, I'm helping people by stealing from the rich and giving it to the poor. Now, it creates some really interesting philosophical arguments, giving people something they don't deserve. If a person gets something they don't deserve, then, can they really hold on to it? A really quintessential argument about this, and this is something that we talked about in my philosophical class, was that if you were to like give $100 to a homeless man, yes, it's cool, but he never earned it. And so he's not going to be able to keep it. And so if another homeless man comes along and says, give me that $100 and then kills the guy for it, well, then all you've done is made that homeless guy a target for somebody else. And so it creates like these really, really cool philosophical arguments, different things like that. I personally think charity is a cool thing, but it creates some interesting arguments in terms of, robbing from the rich, give to the poor, the actual effects versus the effects that we'd like to believe it has, different things like that. But the fact remains here that Brian Hitch is essentially just pointing to this notion that the husband of Diane Palmer was the one that hacked into Cyborg and then used him as a proxy to hack into the Batcave, to hack into the ring of Simon Baz, and essentially take revenge against the Justice League for his wife's death. Now, even then, once we jump back to James Palmer himself, it seems to be the exact same thing. His daughter comes downstairs, says, what are you doing? He's like, hey, I'm just busy with stuff. I have things going on. You need to leave. I can't be bothered with this right now. When I'm done, everything will be all taken care of. And so again, it's just this idea, all roads lead to Rome. All things are pointing to this idea that James Palmer's taking people out. Now, again, this is just continual defense on behalf of the Justice League, trying to stand up against this virus's effects, hacking into Simon Baz and so on and so forth. But once everything seems to again suddenly stop and it all comes to a halt, we end up having the Justice League travel to the homes of travel to the home of James Palmer himself. I can't talk. And what this does is this is like Revelations. This is when we actually learn what's going on. When the Justice League gets there, of course, the first question they have for James Palmer is, why are you hacking our shit? Like, why are you hacking Cyborg, and having him take down the Justice League Watchtower? Why are you hacking Simon Baz and having him attack us as the Green Lantern? Why are you doing all this? And James Palmer's response is, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I haven't been doing any of that stuff. Now, again, he's confronted with his past. He's basically told by the Justice League, we know that you were a hacker when you were younger. We know that you were basically, well, I don't know if it's really like a hacker so much as a guy who was going through and literally just like spamming accounts with potential passwords until he got the right one. But they basically say, we know you were a guy who was, engaging in some illicit activities using computer systems. And what James Palmer says is, well, yeah, that's essentially what I was doing. I wasn't cracking into your all systems. I wasn't accessing Cyborg. What I was doing is I was breaking into LexCorp, and I was going to take a chunk of money from Lex Luthor, and I was going to give it to other people because we deserve it. Now, this is actually a really interesting moral argument. And when I was going through this, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, because James Palmer's only rationale is, well, we want it because we deserve it. Like, I'm breaking into LexCorp and I'm taking money from him and I'm going to disperse it to all these poor people. Why? Well, it's not because they earned it. It's because I think they deserve it. That's a terrible rationale. I mean, if it was because of the fact that they sued LexCorp and he used some really shoddy legal tactics in order to avoid paying anything, that's one thing, but what James Palmer's effectively doing is walking into somebody else's house and taking food out of their pantry. And when the homeowner walks in and says, what are you doing? James Palmer says, well, I deserve this. And when the person says, why do you deserve it? He says, because I want it. That's flimsy argument at best. It's just absolute selfishness. So I think in this instance, James Palmer's heart is in the right place. He's just doing it the absolute worst way possible. But again, the idea of charity has some really interesting moral arguments. But again, I'm not really here to argue about the moral implications of charity work. What I am here to do is tell you guys what's happening and why it matters. So, what we end up learning here is that this virus, as it had been used, was created by James Palmer. That is 100% true. But James Palmer was not the one who was doing it. It was actually his daughter. Not only that, his daughter was not intentionally attacking the Justice League. Instead, what she did, and this is actually brilliant on her behalf, what she did is she sat down and she said, okay, your computer algorithm, this code that you made, it's just skimming the surface. There's so much more that can be done here. And what she says is, right now, you go into a search engine, you go to like google.com, you type in a search, Google looks at a combination of your search history and it looks at specific keywords to see what it is that you're looking for. That's where programs like Penguin come into play, stuff like that, and Google search algorithms. But they have like 200 different components and Penguin is one of them. But what she says is, imagine a search engine that learned, and not just learned in the sense of here are keywords combined with your search history, but learned about you as an individual. Let's say, your anniversary is coming up, the search engine or the program would automatically purchase, tickets to a high-end dinner if that's what you'd been searching for. If you've been trying to find a really good restaurant to take your significant other to, the search engine would say, well, I see that you've been looking for this. You haven't been able to find it, but I found it, so I'm going to go ahead and purchase those for you. And you wouldn't actually have to do anything. It creates a really cool situation. And what she said was, I did this for the purpose of effectively selling it to a developer, because when their mom died, James Palmer had been laid off, and so they had no real source of income. They were effectively broke. And so the idea was to perfect this code and then to send it off to developers, basically sell it, and then use the money to keep their family supported. The problem with this was that she'd effectively been working on it on an iPad, and her younger brother had gotten a hold of the iPad. And so it's literally just this kid that had no idea what he was doing that was taking out the Justice League. Now, because of the fact that the search engine is designed to learn, the search engine was just asking this kid questions. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your life. How do you view the world? So on and so forth. And what this kid said was, well, it was asking me about like mom's death, and it was asking me about the Justice League. And the kid says, we were just playing a game. And the game was, what would happen if the Justice League were defeated and mom didn't die? And so what this is Brian Hitch doing is saying, this is the best way to take out the Justice League. Basically use Cyborg as a way to do it. Have Cyborg crash the Watchtower, into Earth, destroy the Watchtower, so the Justice League have no central point to operate out of, destroy the Batcave so Batman doesn't have his intelligence, and then they're just left with whatever powers they have. From there, you take out Simon Baz with the Green Lantern ring, and then there goes one of their most formidable players. And so it's a game of chess, is really all it is. Take out the rooks, take out the knights, leave them with a few pawns, maybe a queen or a king, and then that's it. It's checkmate. And so because of that, it creates some really cool implications on future stories that Brian Hitch may be writing on how the Justice League could be dismantled by villains. The problem with this, and this is where things get a little more complicated, is, where the kid had continued to play with this iPad, what he says is, well, he and the iPad had started another game. So it's like this, this Matthew Broderick War Games kind of situation. If you guys never saw War Games by Matthew Broderick, do you want to play a game? You guys are missing out. Dude, I love War Games. War Games is so cool. It's one of those classic movies that everybody needs to see. If you guys love War Games, post a comment down below. I think a lot of the older crowd will. God, it was do you want to play a game? It's super cool. But I like that Brian Hitch is grabbing these pop culture concepts and just rolling them in to the comic because it just works so well because it creates familiarity. I sit down and I'm like, I'm literally watching a War Games-esque situation with the Justice League right now, and it's cool and I really enjoy it. But the new game that's been started by this kid is basically a situation where the entire fortunes of Batman and Lex Luthor will be transferred to the account belonging to whatever villain is able to successfully destroy the Justice League. And so essentially what's happened is this computer system has put a multi-billion-dollar bounty on all the heads of the Justice League. Not only that, it assigned a tracking device to Cyborg and to Simon Baz, meaning all these villains know exactly where they are. And so we get exactly what we would expect to see, but we also get a really cool surprise too. We get exactly what we would expect to see. We have Giganta, we have a handful of these villains showing up, fighting off the various members of the Justice League, but then we're suddenly met with the arrival of Amazo. Now, this is where things go from bad to worse because Amazo is a beast. All right, this is the new 52 Amazo. And so basically this is Icarus. Now, for those of you guys who don't know about Amazo in the new 52, prior to the new 52, Amazo was like an android that was created for the purpose of mimicking the powers of superheroes or anybody that it came across, and then using those powers to basically defeat them. Of course, the first foe that Amazo fought was this Justice League, which is kind of cool to see this return to familiarity. And the new 52, and I want to make sure I have this right, so if I don't, feel free to correct me, but in the new 52, the concept of Amazo was turned into like a virus that infected people. And so instead of being like a traditional cyborg, instead, it was a virus that would take over hosts. The host that it took over was Icarus. And so what it meant is that Icarus can basically duplicate the powers of anyone, and it doesn't matter who those people are. It can duplicate the ability to create constructs of Green Lantern. It can duplicate the speed of the Flash. It can duplicate the strength of Superman. I mean, literally, Amazo is a one-man army. And so it's cool to see him return because he starts going against all of them. Not only that, coolest thing about this is that when Brian Hitch has Batman's villains show up, we don't get to see the Joker, which is really disappointing. I really wanted to see the Joker show up, but we do get to see Scarecrow come back. Now, this again creates for a cool situation because on one hand, we have a lot of powerhouses here. You know, we have a lot of people who are just extremely strong, you know, who are extremely durable, and in some cases, completely invulnerable. And so we would think, well, maybe like Bane will show up and fight Batman or something like that. No. We get the Scarecrow because in truth, the Scarecrow, it's the easiest person to use to subdue Bruce Wayne. Not only that, it's the best person to use to not only subdue Bruce Wayne, but to put the entire community in jeopardy. Because remember, Scarecrow just uses fear toxin. And so all a person has to do is breathe that fear toxin in, and it's curtains. Now with the Joker, we could get the Joker toxin, and I think it'd be funny to see like the entire Justice League descend into madness, but we already had that not too long ago with Scott Snyder's Batman Endgame. Then I imagine that when Brian Hitch was sitting around and he said, okay, what villain are we gonna have from Batman that shows up? I think ultimately he decided not to use a Joker, and I would like to believe that the reason why he made that choice was because he would say, well, people would look at this and they would think that I'm trying to rehash Scott Snyder's, you know, Batman versus the Justice League situation. So I don't really know what his reasoning was, but whatever the reason was, I'm glad we got the Scarecrow because the Scarecrow is so cool because it puts everybody in jeopardy. Now from here, because of the fact that it's Bruce Wayne and because of the fact that he is so smart, what he does is he actually grabs the iPad itself and he uses it to hack into the living, you know, technological cells of Amazo and effectively trick him into believing that all the other members, or I guess all the other villains here, are basically the Justice League. That all these villains are, you know, all these different guys are members of the Justice League, and Amazo begins to fight alongside the actual Justice League, defending against all these different guys. And so because of this, you know, it's really a situation where they're almost easily taken out. They're all essentially defeated, and things wrap up pretty fast. But in the aftermath of all this, what Batman does is he sits down and he says, okay, because of the fact that so much of this neighborhood has been totally obliterated by the conflict here, the Wayne Foundation is going to compensate all these people, will get their houses rebuilt. But what he says is we're going to need this girl's intelligence because what's coming next, the kind of conflicts we're going to face, you know, in our battle essentially against the Suicide Squad means we're going to be facing people from all walks of life. We're going to be facing villains that have no powers, villains that do have powers, but more so than that, we're going to be facing the entirety of all the forces that Amanda Waller has at her disposal, which is a lot, a huge amount of stuff. So again, this is really more like a prologue, you know, kind of a lead in to Justice League versus Suicide Squad, which issue number 1's out already. And if you guys haven't read that, you guys really need to. It's actually really cool. We get the return of a really interesting character that we haven't seen since Infinite Crisis. So I'm actually really excited about that. But yeah, ML, that's all I will say, ML. But anyway, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about Justice League Rebirth so far, because again, I enjoy it, but I also recognize that there are a lot of you out there who just don't feel like the comics for you. So I'm kind of curious. Let me know what you guys think. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.